Hello and welcome to Wilson Center. Now I'm John Molesky. This is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the program is available the way you're watching it on video, or maybe if you're listening on podcast as well. And check us out at wilsoncenter.org to find out what's coming up. Our guest today is Ruth Greenspan Bell, and Ruth is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, and she joins us today to discuss climate change, a small topic, nothing that will...
Right, that should only take a few seconds.
Ruth, no laughing matter is the IPCC report, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that came out a couple of weeks ago. And what a lot of people commented on and what they found striking was the language that scientists use, more vivid, more perhaps even alarmist. Some use the word scary than we've seen in previous iterations. What do you make of that?
You know, it's very interesting when you ask scientists to answer questions related to policy. The whole training and culture of scientists is to question things, right?
Right.
So that's what they do. They don't try to come up with absolute truths because they know that the whole method is to keep questioning and keep asking and to drive toward knowledge. In this case, they were asked specifically to talk about what the consequences would be of a 1.5 degree warmed world and a 2 degree warmed world. You may remember.
And we're already at a 1, is that correct?
We're at a 1.
Yeah.
But you know, what's really, one of the points they made that's quite interesting is, yes, globally we're more or less at a 1, but certain parts of the globe actually are well above 1 in different times of the year. So the Arctic is warmer in the winter. There are parts of lower latitudes that are warmer during other seasons. So we're talking about averages, but what they're trying to explain is the impacts are not always uniform globally. But the point I'm trying to make is that they have been tasked with an assignment that is a little bit contrary to how they approach their life in general, their day job. And it's been very interesting. And yes, the language is quite strong and surprisingly strong, given that it's scientists who are making these calls.
Now, some non-scientists who've also said, I've also read criticism saying, well, not scary enough, given the gravity of the situation. How do you calibrate urgency? We don't seem to be getting people's attention.
You know, look, here's the problem. If you look at polling, for example, a heavy percentage of Americans think that climate change is a real issue. The problem is how they prioritize it, and they don't give high priority to it for action. So, and a lot of Americans we're just focusing here obviously on Americans, a lot of Americans think that at least until recently, have thought that the damages, the consequences of this will not fall so heavily on Americans. It will fall elsewhere. People in Africa, people in Asia are going to be hurt. They kind of have not believed that this could be happening here. Now, I don't know what's going to happen now that we've gone through these really devastating weather events and these droughts and the flooding, but those are all just weather events, and there always has been weather. So to kind of believe that that's going to move people along in their thinking about this deeper issue, we just don't know.
I heard one meteorologist today say, and an unofficial count, of course, but something to the effect that these so-called 100-year storms, we've had 25 of them in the last 10 years. If they only come every 100 years, we're way ahead of schedule. Other things in the report, it's saying averting climate crisis will require a wholesale reinvention of the global economy by 2040, not the distant future.
Yeah.
And some of the apocalyptic things highlighted global food shortages, inundation of coastal cities, a refugee crisis unlike the world has ever seen. And you mentioned the Arctic and the melting of permafrost and the opening of new sea lanes. In many ways, it's here. We no longer should be talking about this as things that might happen. It's happening.
None of this should be a surprise if anybody's really been following the evolving science. What the surprise is that these scientists have chosen just to be so direct about what's going on. Yeah, we have to pay serious attention. And can we do something about it? Well, you know, they have kind of two scenarios. They have the scenario in which we try to mitigate to try to get to that 1.5 goal or the under 2 goal, which they say also already is way too high for our safety. The second scenario is we overshoot, but we use various methods to try to bring ourselves back again. They're not recommending that because the consequences of that, we all know about tipping points and jagged, edges and how unforeseen consequences can happen. But now
it's the classic Frankenstein story. You mess with science and you're not sure what might happen.
But they're starting to talk about things like what we used to lump under geoengineering, things like removing CO2 from the atmosphere and somehow storing it and bringing us back from the brink. So it's an interesting kind of full exposition of a lot of different ways of managing this.
The storms we've seen just recently, the Hurricane Michael, of course, President Trump in an interview on 60 Minutes no longer said that climate change is a hoax. He was one of the leading voices calling it a hoax in the past. He said he now believes it, but he was iffy about whether he thought it warranted any immediate action. But with all these things starting to trend in this direction, and you say public opinion polls show of a majority of Americans and a majority of people around the globe believe it's real, even if they may differ on some of the details. Are we reaching a tipping point for action? Or am I being overly optimistic to even suggest that?
I wish I had a crystal ball for a variety of reasons, I mean, in that same interview, he didn't say it was a hoax, but he also said it wasn't clear that humans had any responsibility for it. And then he, at the very end, and this is really sad and critically important, he basically claimed that the scientists had a political agenda.
Right, which clouded all of the other previous remarks.
So what does all the rest of it mean?
Right. So beyond American politics, what's happening globally after the U.S. plans to withdraw from the Paris Agreement? Yeah. Is there still a lot of activity?
Okay, so the kind of assumption behind the Paris Agreement was that we all knew that holding it to under 2 or even to 1.5 was probably not adequate. And we knew that we were on a trajectory, as we currently are, to blow well past all that. But the underlying idea, which was a really good and noble idea, was that if we all got together and made internal commitments country by country, and then we stayed together kind of in a pack and nudged ourselves forward, building on some level of success, that maybe we could overcome some of those obstacles and get moving. The predicate for that, however, was that there were motivating countries or leadership countries that would take things forward. And the leadership countries in 2015 were assumed to be the US and the French and the Germans. Well, we know what's happened in terms of the US. We are no longer a leader on this. Certain states are, California, a lot of other states, but nationally, no. Angela Merkel clearly believes very strongly in climate change, but look at what she's having to contend with these days. That's not her priority. Just staying alive politically is her priority. And in France, the environment minister dropped out of his office because he was upset about the direction that his country was taking. So we're kind of left with China, and that's a whole separate segment for you about whether China can actually be a leader in this. And that's what's really threatening to the progress of the Paris Accord.
You can't bait the hook and expect me not to bite. Can China be a leader?
China has made all the right sounds, and it is making some progress. It's also investing heavily internationally in coal and coal-driven power plants and similar quite energy inefficient approaches. So it's kind of saying two things.
Mixed messages.
Yes, mixed messages.
Speaking of carbon-based fuels, and carbon pricing has come up as a potential solution. What are some of the most hopeful solutions out there? I know, obviously things like alternative fuel sources, wind power, whatever it might be, but where do you see the most traction?
That's a hard question to answer. Let me answer it in a slightly different way. I'm hoping that we're long past the point of thinking there are big silver bullets for a problem so complex and so layered and so messy and so wicked. So I think the way to approach this is throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, and then throw some more spaghetti. You know, I'm a big fan of Yale political science professor Charles Lindblom, who talked about the art and science of muddling through. And what he was really talking about was the fact that there are rarely very big solutions to big problems, that you have to take these things incrementally as a learning experience and keep plowing forward, and then you can make a difference. And I think there's no answer for climate change, but that's how I think things can most profitably proceed.
Just the way you talk about this and the way scientists talk about this, it shows the mismatch between politicians who will speak with certainty versus people who will be honest about what we don't know.
Yeah.
It seems like that's a difficult gap to close.
Yeah, I mean, look, you get elected because you're trying to provide answers to tough questions. In some cases, complex issues don't have single answers, or don't even have a handful of answers. Maybe they have a lot of different answers. It's not like fighting a war. We're encountering something we've never encountered before in human history, a challenge that's kind of bigger than anything we've ever before addressed, and it's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of out-of-the-box thinking and a lot of people willing to take chances and challenge the American public and try to move things forward that way.
I'm going to take one more stab at a potential bright spot in this. What about generationally? You know, a lot of issues, when you break them down generationally, you start to see different ideas emerging or different sentiments emerging, or in this case, perhaps a different sense of urgency for action. What do we see when we look at the U.S. electorate and we divide it by generations?
You know, it's very interesting watching this new generation come up. There are a lot of people who don't own cars. There are a lot of people who are in the sharing economy. They have a different attitude toward owning things. And that's a good question. Maybe that's what's going to bring us along. And I talk to a lot of young people who are acutely aware that this is an issue for their future and know we need to do something about it.
Final thought is, are there any other upcoming signposts we should be watching? Any plans for international meetings or other reports that we can look to? What should we be looking at if we want to monitor the situation?
Well, we know that there's, the next big annual meeting is in Poland. It's an odd place for it, given Poland's commitment to coal. But maybe that's a good place to start discussing how we're going to go about this. Look, this is the issue for us now. It affects everything, as we know. It affects defense, it affects security, it affects how we feed ourselves, it affects where we live, it affects how we build things. It's just, baked into everything, every part of human life now. So,
yeah, there's no avoiding
it. That's
it. As always, we can always hope that at some point we see the kind of action that we yearn for in this area.
I have grandchildren.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
why
I aspire to.
on it.
I aspire to. Ruth, thank you for joining us. I know this is not an easy topic.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to you as well. I hope that you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again in the future, again, either via video or our new podcast. Take care. Thank you.